Guys, welcome to JPT. I'm Carson G, and this is Just Plain Tech. Welcome to the first of our beginner's guide series of videos. Today, in this video, we're just going to go over Linux in general, what it is, and why you should switch to it. If you know nothing about Linux and you don't know what you want, if you want to switch to it, or you don't know anything about it, then you're in the right place. This is the perfect video for you. Make sure you watch the entire thing so that you don't miss anything and you get all the information you need correctly, okay? It is a bit of an adjustment, but I think you will definitely benefit from it. Alright? This is one of the first of many beginner's guide videos. This is just Linux in general, as I said before, but I will also do distro-specific Linux guides, like different distributions like Debian, Slackware, Ubuntu, Linux Mint, and OpenSUSE, with more to come, okay? Now, you might be wondering, what is a Linux distribution? Well, Linux isn't just one operating system. When you say Linux, you could mean Linux in general, like what I'm saying, like counting all Linux distributions and everything Linux, or the Linux kernel. So, Linux is actually an operating system kernel invented by Linus Torvalds in 1992, and he actually still works on it to this day. But, of course, he has a lot of community support. But the Linux kernel is a command line. For those of you who don't know what a kernel is a command line behind the operating system. Remember, for those of you who remember how you used to run Windows on top of MS-DOS, let's say that, like, MS-DOS is your kernel, and then, I don't know, Windows is your operating system, so MS-DOS was the kernel behind Windows, which was the operating system, so that's kind of the best beginner explanation I can give it. So that's pretty much what a kernel is, and a Linux distribution is pretty much any operating system that runs on the Linux kernel, which you may use Linux more than you know. For example, Android actually uses the Linux kernel. Chromebooks use the Linux kernel. Mac and Windows do not, but Chromebooks and Android do. So you may already be using Linux by Android or Chromebook. But today we're more explaining actual, like, Linux distributions that are distributed under Linux. Just because something uses the Linux kernel doesn't mean it is, it is Linux, but you know, it might not always be distributed or considered Linux. Like, Chromebooks are Chromebooks. Like, does Google really tell you it's a Linux distribution? They want you to think it's their own thing, but anyway. Alright, so let's begin. Linux is freedom. I'm serious. You can literally do anything you want with your Linux installation. You are not limited by end-user license agreement, anything like that. The limit is literally your own computer skills. You can do anything, like pretty much anything that you have the knowledge to do, you can do with your computer. So that is really nice. Linux is also open source, which means that instead of, for example, Windows is a closed source operating system. Only Microsoft can contribute to Windows. Only they can make bugs, add new features, blah blah blah. Linux is open source, so the community, as in you and me or everybody, they can add whatever they want to their Linux, they can contribute any way they want. They can fix bugs, they can fix new features, they can add new features, they can contribute to Linux. So because Linux allows this whole community to contribute to it, it helps Linux teams fix bugs faster and just move on and advance faster. Some Linux distributions, such as Ubuntu, which if you've been looking at Linux online, you've probably come across Ubuntu. It is the most popular Linux distribution. So Ubuntu is maintained by Canonical. Canonical is a company, but since it is open source, the community also contributes to it. There's a large community of Ubuntu that contribute to Ubuntu, so it's maintained by Canonical and the community. Some other Linux distributions, such as Debian or Fedora or CentOS, you may not know what distributions I'm talking about if you're watching this for the first time, but subscribe so you don't miss out on the future videos of these explanations, and don't worry, I was new to this once too. You will understand it in no time. But say distros such as Debian, Fedora, or CentOS, they are maintained fully by the community. They don't have a company that makes them. It's just the community. There's a community out there that works on them all the time. So, but, like, there's also, bugs get fixed quickly, but there's also a large community that can support you. If you're new to Linux, you can always go to, like, the Linux Mint forums or something like that, forums, and then, you can just basically tell them what your problem is, and either somebody from the Linux Mint team or community members, whatever, they will go and help you with your problem, and that's usually really nice. Another thing is Linux lets you choose. You choose what you do with your operating system. You choose when you install updates, which, by the way, is a big one. I think we're all tired of Microsoft just forcing us to update whenever it feels like. Linux will tell you when you have updates, but it will let you run them literally whenever you want. It will only tell you once in your notifications feed. It will not bother you every 5 minutes. Hey, you have updates, you have updates, you have updates, you have updates, you have updates. It will just let you know in your notifications, and it will let you take care of them whenever you're ready. It will not bother you about updates. So that is really nice. Although I would update every now and then. Some distros do get a lot of updates. But you can choose which Linux distribution you want. So you can choose which one fits your needs the best. And then Linux has a ton of customization. You can also customize your Linux distribution specifically exactly to your needs if there's something that you need. I don't know. If there's something that you want that isn't already in your Linux distribution, you can probably put it in there and customize it real nicely. But you might be wondering, well, there's so many Linux distributions out there. There are thousands. How am I supposed to choose? Well, when I was a starter with Linux, I didn't know how to install anything. I was only 8 years old, actually. So, I got a computer with Ubuntu. So, if you're not sure what to try out, try Ubuntu. It's the most popular Linux distribution. A lot of people like it. Another one you could try is Linux Mint, which is based on Ubuntu. And, yeah. So, if you're having a little more trouble choosing your Linux distribution, click this video up here. That will help you learn or figure out how to choose which Linux distribution is right for you. But if you don't know, I would just go with Ubuntu to start out with. Or Ubuntu or Linux Mint are the two I'd recommend for beginners. Just do one of those. If you don't like Ubuntu, try Mint. If there's a Linux distribution that you don't really like very well, or it doesn't run your computer very well, you can always try a different one. Like, if you accidentally did something wrong in the installation, and all of a sudden you try and reboot, you have no operating system on your computer. There's still a way. Your computer's not finished. Just because there's no OS doesn't mean that your computer's done. You can always, if something goes terribly wrong and your hard drive isn't booting or something like that, you can always just install another operating system. So there's nothing to be scared about when it comes to breaking your computer. It's probably not going to happen. Let's see. Linux will run on most modern Linux distributions such as Debian, Ubuntu, Linux Mint, Fedora, CentOS, on and on. Will most likely run on any 32-bit or 64-bit computer. So yes, if you have a 15-year-old computer sitting out in the garage collecting dust, you could actually install Linux on that computer and spring life back to it. Now, I'd recommend at least 512 megabytes of RAM for most of these distros to run. Probably, some of them probably 1 gigabyte of RAM to run nicely. 512 megabytes will probably do just fine. If you have lower than that, such as 256 megabytes of RAM, you might want to get a Linux distribution such as Puppy Linux, which is up here if you want to check that out. A Linux distribution that can boot into your RAM, but is very, very small. And it will run on pretty much all RAM. But if you have something even older than that, you could use Tiny Core Linux. Check that out up here. It's even smaller than Puppy Linux, but it is a bare bones distro. You have to install your media codecs and everything. Puppy Linux comes with all your media codecs, and just like a working operating system, Tiny Core Linux, you have to install a ton of drivers, which is kind of annoying. Alright, like I said, you can choose a Linux distribution that will work with you. Many cool features. You will also have a ton of features that you will notice in your Linux distribution that weren't there in Windows, and probably will never come to Windows. Because let's be honest, Windows is stuck in the past, people. So yeah, like, you can switch workspaces. There are some Linux distributions that come with 2, 3, 4 workspaces that you can switch between. Say you have one desktop that's full of Windows and you just need to start something fresh, but you want to keep what you have there because you're working on it, but you're just going to do something else for a minute. You can switch to another workspace, a fresh desktop, ready to do whatever you need it to do. So that is really nice, and it doesn't take up much processing power either. Like, you can use 4 workspaces at a time on a computer with 1 gigabyte of RAM and a 32-bit processor. I'm serious. Because I actually do it. I actually use a computer with 1 gigabyte of RAM and an Intel Atom 32-bit processor. Anyway, this will probably buy most of you. Free software. Linux distributions come with bundles of free software, and they also have, which leads me to another thing, they also have a software store which you can get your software from. Are you tired of going to the internet, taking an hour searching for the right exe file, hoping it's not a virus, and learning it's a free trial version and you have to pay for it? That's Windows life, people. Yep, we've all been there, and we're getting away from it. Alright? Linux software. Most Linux distributions have a software store. If not, you can install a software store. But most Linux distributions have actually a software store where you can literally just click the icon, has thousands of software to choose from, hundreds of thousands of software to choose from, and it's really nice. Most of that software will run on pretty much any computer, just like Linux itself. So you're not limited by what your hardware can do as much. I mean, obviously you still are, but you're not as limited by what your hardware can do as if you had an old computer, there'd be much more software you can run on Linux than you could ever run on Windows. So, yeah. And most of it will run pretty much fine. And if you can't find something you're looking for on the software, you can obviously go on the internet and add additional repositories to get more apps if you want to do that. But for most of you, the Ubuntu Software Center or the Mint install will work just fine for you. So, free software, great software store. It's all free, open source, and it's not pirating. We're not pirating any software or anything like that. It's literally software developed by Linux contributors and developers. So say I developed a video editor and put it on Linux. That's literally what happens. People around the world just develop software for Linux. It's not being pirated or anything. It's literally their own software for Linux, and it's really nice. All right. And now you might be thinking, well, how do I install it? Like, do I have to get rid of Windows? I have all my stuff on Windows. I don't want to back it up, or my flash drive's not big enough, or don't worry about that. Even if you only have like a 50 gigabyte hard drive or a 2 gigabyte hard drive, well, yeah, that might not be enough. You'd probably need to give your Linux distribution, most modern Linux distributions, you'd need to give them at least 10 gigabytes of storage space to work with. I would recommend at least 30 if you have enough space, but to get it to run, you probably need at least 10. Most of them take around 6 to 10 gigabytes. So I would recommend at least, like the bare minimum is like 10 gigabytes. I'd probably recommend for a nice installation, you have enough space for everything, I'd recommend at least 30 gigabytes. But 30 gigabytes would probably be fine. 50 gigabytes would be better. You know, the more storage space, the better. But say you don't want to get rid of Windows. Here's what you do. You can literally install Linux alongside Windows. Say you have a hard drive with 500 gigabytes on it. Say Windows takes all that up. Most Linux distributions like Ubuntu, Debian, Linux Mint, etc. have easy installers that will actually let you shrink Windows. Say if you have 500 gigabytes, you shrink Windows down to 250 gigabytes, and then you have an extra free 250 gigabytes of space for Linux, which is great. And then, so you have half hard drive Windows, half is Linux, and then you'd say, well, how do I use Windows, or how do I use Linux? It will actually install a bootloader called Grub, which will let you choose between Windows and Linux when you start up your computer. It will let you choose which one you want to boot into, and it will all work real nice. But that bootloader might have a lot of extra messy options on there, and it might end up looking really messy, and it's not very organized. So you could watch this video up here to customize your Grub to look nice. And most of it is easy to install. If you don't know how to install Linux yourself, look at one of my videos. Go check out some of my videos, or check out somebody else's videos, or any tutorial you need to install Linux on your computer. So, having all that said, there's really no reason not to switch to Linux. Free software, cool features, runs on any computer, you can dual boot it with Windows. There's literally no reason not to. It's amazing, guys. So, I would recommend doing it. It's definitely worth your time and effort installing it. It will really only take about an hour to install fully, like formatting the disk, installing it to your computer, setting up the installation, letting it install. Put it all together, it will probably take only about an hour. It really doesn't take that long. After you get everything set up and you set up your installation, just installing the system, you can literally just leave it there and let it do its thing. It will only take like 20 minutes. So, yeah. So make sure to subscribe if you want to see more videos about this. I'm going to do more beginner's guide videos in the future. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. We'll see you next time.